Well, welcome. Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending from where in the world you're joining us today. I'm delighted to welcome you to the third in our series of webinars this year on fundraising and sport for development. I think it's fair to say last year when we launched this series in March, we had no idea just how much interest and how much engagement we would get through the series. It's been really overwhelming, and yeah, that's through a combination of factors. I think really importantly, the kind of diversity and the caliber of panelists and speakers that we've been able to attract, but I think really, obviously crucially, just through the level of engagement and interest from you, the audience. So thank you again for joining us and making this another great session today, I've no doubt. So for those of you who don't know, my name is Luke Selfall and I'm Managing Director at Oaks, and we work with sport for development organisations across the world, supporting with strategy, fundraising, sustainability and capacity building. And I'll be the moderator for today's discussion. So in January this year, we launched our second annual Fundraising in Sport for Development State of the Sector report, the results of which have formed the basis of the series throughout the year. And by the way of a brief recap, I think it's just worth highlighting some of the kind of key findings. So generally, the findings were positive, actually, and we had quite a precipitous upturn, both in terms of the confidence and performance of fundraising across the sector compared with the previous year. For instance, 53% of organisations we spoke to were forecasting an increase in income this year compared to only 25% in the previous year. And almost 2/3 of those organisations were expecting further increases in the year ahead. And we weren't getting carried away because obviously there were still some areas that presented real cause for concern, with 37% of organisations we spoke to reducing their fundraising expected expenditure this year, and only 29% of those who did that meeting or exceeding their targets. And 42% of organisations who did experience income reduction cited not having enough people with the right fundraising skills as the primary reason. And I think it's also really cogent for this event to kind of frame it within the broader context of the 2022 socio-political environment. Obviously, we've got the post-pandemic recovery, we've got the war in Ukraine, and we've got the global cost of living crisis, all seismic developments, which I'm sure will no doubt have a significant impact on the fundraising landscape. So with all that in mind, the focus of today's session is absolutely about how we can maximize our fundraising resource, time, energy to deliver the greatest possible impact in this area. So through the discussion, we'll explore how we can prioritize our resources and make difficult choices about which areas in which to invest. We'll explore specific fundraising areas and how we can make the most out of them, how we can utilize every single tool and asset at our disposal to support fundraising efforts, and what we need to do to ready ourselves for the future changes within the fundraising landscape. And what a panel of speakers we have to talk us through it. We've got, I think, a fantastic mix today of both sport for development and out of sector expertise, which we've always found to be an invaluably unique combination of perspectives. So before we go any further, it gives me great pleasure to hand over to them to introduce themselves. And I'll start from the top of my screen, and Suheil, come to you first.
Thanks, Luke. Thanks for having me, and really looking forward to the discussions. Hi, everyone. My name is Suheil Tandon, and I'm the director founder of Pro Sport Development. Pro Sport Development is a social enterprise based in India, using sport and physical activity for the holistic development of young people. Looking forward. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Suheil. Katie, I could come to you next, and welcome back. Great to see you again.
Thank you, and thank you very much for having me back. And hello to those of you who I've seen on previous webinars. So I'm Katie Bowyer. I'm the Director of Fundraising Strategy for the British Red Cross. So my role is really about looking at how we drive growth and transformation within our fundraising. Probably the Red Cross movement doesn't need a lot of explanation, but just sort of in short, we're an organisation that's there for people in crisis. So we're a sort of first response humanitarian agency. We operate pretty much in every country across the world, and the British Red Cross splits its time probably about 50-50 between work in the UK, so supporting people in crisis within the UK, and then also supporting through our international movement areas of the world that particularly need help. So my my job is funding both of those streams of work.
Well, thanks, Katie. Hayley, welcome.
Hiya, thanks for having me. It's my first time here, so thanks for inviting me. So I'm from Macmillan Cancer Support, and we're a UK-based charity. So we're here to support people affected by cancer within the UK, and that's providing a range of support, from practical support, financial support, which is very much in need now, emotional support, and through a huge range of ways within the UK, and we work with our NHS as well. So I'm a fundraising director there, and I'm one of 6 fundraising directors, so just to give a bit of a scale of the size of our organisation here. And my areas of responsibility is challenge events, relationship fundraising, which is our UK-wide fundraising team that very much work in local communities, and our supported care team, which are the people that answer all our phones and emails from all of our supporters. So that's a bit about us. So thanks for having us, Luke.
Great. Thanks, all. Yeah, what a privilege to have such an esteemed panel of speakers today. Can't wait to hear what you've all got to say. So before we start, also a big thanks to our kind of continued series partners, Laurie Sport for Good Foundation, Street Football World, sportanddev.org, and Tafisa for their ongoing and continued support in promoting and supporting the series. I also will say, and come back to this at the end, but today marks the launch of our survey for the 22-23 report that we'll be undertaking in the next few months. So we will talk about the links and how people get involved with that at the end of the session. And obviously, really important to say, no doubt you all in the audience will have lots and lots of questions to put to our panel. So please get them in as we go in the Q&A box, and I'll put as many of them as possible to the panel as we go. Perfect. Right, let's get started then. So Suheil, I'll come to you first. And I mentioned some of the findings at the top there from our report, and obviously some of the wider kind of socio-political factors at play at the moment. But I'm just keen to just kind of get a general sense from you on the ground, what it kind of feels like at the moment from a fundraising perspective. What's it like for you and your network of partners? What's the kind of mood music? What's the feeling at the moment around fundraising?
So COVID-19 obviously was very tough for the sector, especially for smaller organizations, community-based sport for development organizations. But as the report states, I think things are starting to look better. I think funders are taking interest in sport-based approaches to rebuild from COVID-19, because of the power of sport to be able to impact health and well-being, but also well-designed S4D programs being able to take forward inclusivity, equitable outreach of sport. So that kind of factors as well. I think since the last year and a half, I think sport and sport for development is being valued by stakeholders a bit more. A small example, we spent considerable time trying to work with parents to sort of show them the importance of our programming, but COVID for us just made them realize how important sport was for their children. So that kind of, and that's the same thing we've seen with funders and donors. An example is last year after the Tokyo 2020 Olympics and India's a good performance, a lot of the corporate world has now taken interest in funding grassroots sport and sport for development programs. Earlier, they were mostly funding more elite and performance sports. Sure. So that shift is happening, but still a lot more has to be done. But things look, I've spoken to a lot of people, there's a lot more corporate funding being driven into sport for development, grassroots sports. It's a mixed bag, though. Some people are at different stages of coming out of the impact of COVID-19. But I feel that, like the report says, the signs are positive.
Bro, that's really good to hear, Suheil. And we'll come on to some of those more specific fundraising streams a bit later in the discussion. And Hayley, I'd be keen to get a similar perspective from you. And obviously, in your intro, you helpfully kind of outlined the scale of the fundraising team within your organization. So yeah, it'd be good. How have you found it? How are you kind of feeling it at the moment in terms of the fundraising landscape?
What I would say is challenging. We started the year really optimistic, having bounced back fairly well from COVID. We really did see a really big impact from COVID on our income, and as we sort of got through to the end of last year, we had a good year, and this year we felt really optimistic. However, there's lots going on in the marketplace from a fundraising perspective. So you mentioned them earlier: the cost of living crisis, the UK war. And just, I suppose, for us as a charity, easing back into people's normal lives after COVID, and then the competition we've had from everyday social activities like weddings, holidays that perhaps we didn't see back in 2021. So we're in a fairly good place, I'd say, Macmillan, from fundraising, bouncing back across most of our income streams, but it has been really challenging, and I actually think going forward it's going to be more challenging than what we thought it would be coming out of COVID, because of all the new things that are coming, that are happening in the world that are impacting us, both from an income perspective. So we are funded 98% by people, so people giving generous donations to us, but also from a expenditure point of view, it's making fundraising a lot more expensive in the long run. So we have to be really careful around the decisions we make. I mentioned that challenge events is part of my remit, and we heavily rely on sports. So when I talk about that from a charity perspective, we're involved in lots of races out there, from Great North Run, London Marathon, and it's what we call the third party market. And then we have our own events. So we've got a big Mighty Hike series that raises about £12 million for us. And then we've also started testing the waters in fundraising on platforms like Facebook, where you at home and you do X amount of burpees or jumps or whatever a month, which has been hugely successful for us during COVID. And we're not quite seeing that success now we've moved on from lockdown, which was expected, but it's still there. So we're hugely reliant on the sports market, but we are seeing a slight drop in participation across the board, really. I think social activity, what I mentioned earlier, is part of that. But I think cost of living crisis, people signing up, paying registration fees, committing to a lot of time is really impactful as well. So for us, it has bounced back, but we're faced with new challenges, is what I would say.
Absolutely. Great, thanks, Hayley. And yeah, Katie, I think similar vein, really. Just, yeah, what's it been like at Red Cross? What's your experience of that been?
Yeah, thank you. And I'd sort of echo what Hayley says. It's been a really interesting few years for, I think, across the sector. And I think what is probably quite interesting is, I think if you'd asked us a few years ago, Hayley and I, both sort of representing large UK charities, would probably have had a similar view of what's going on in the world. And I think actually what we've seen is dependent on your organisation and your cause, we're seeing much more fragmentation in the charity market. And there's a real differentiation, I think, between charities who are doing well, not necessarily even because of any sort of particular resource or skill they're putting in, but because they're a cause that particularly resonates at this sort of really challenging time, or they're a cause that's having to fight a little bit harder for space. And I think Hayley said it feels like a very crowded marketplace at the moment. So the British Red Cross has had an incredibly successful couple of years in terms of fundraising. We were on the front line of responding to COVID within the UK, working, across both our own services and with smaller kind of grassroots community organisations within the UK. We were a large part of the response for people both within Afghanistan, working with the Afghan Red Crescent, and then Afghan refugees being resettled in the UK last year. And then obviously this year, the Red Cross movement has been a huge part of the Ukraine humanitarian response. So we've seen an unprecedented level of giving through that, which is absolutely incredible in the sense that we're there to be there for the most sort of acute humanitarian crises. Where I suppose we're seeing the challenge is that looking forward, what that has done is diverted some of that more sustainable income, where we might be talking about, gifts to our work in particular areas around the world, where we would be looking at sustainable programming and development. Actually, a lot of those funds have been diverted to that immediate emergency response, which has been brilliant in the moment, but we're sort of starting to have to think about what does building back from that look like, and what does sort of running both immediate emergency response and being able to build kind of sustainable development for all of our programs look like. And I think that our route is to look at diversifying as much as we can and being able to look as broadly as we can. But I think, I just echo what Hayley was saying about cost of living and inflation is something that we're hugely concerned about. I think it's quite early days in the UK to really understand what the impact is likely to be. We know if you look back at the financial crisis in 2008 in the UK, giving held up a bit better, I think, than anyone anticipated. But we did see things like, for example, lower amounts of sponsorship contributions for challenge events. We did see people who perhaps had multiple direct debits set up to give to organisations, perhaps choosing a fewer number of organisations they wanted to support. And I think it's still quite early to understand what that real impact is likely to be. And I think it will probably take us another year or so to really understand what that's looking like. And we're just trying to make sure that we've got as much of sustainability built in as possible.
Great. Yeah, that was going to be one of my questions, actually, just around how can we plan for that in terms of building that resilience to not only known factors like this, but obviously unknown ones. We're sitting here 12 months ago thinking about the post-pandemic recovery. Now there's other events like this that have such a monumental impact. So Hayley, when you're looking at it from Macmillan, how do you kind of build that into your kind of risk register or your planning when you're looking at sustainability? How can you actually kind of prepare for these things and make sure that you are resilient as much as possible to things that will be out of your control like that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I mean, I don't think any of us was prepared for COVID and lockdown and for it to last quite so long as it did. What I would say is a breadth of program is really important, and not being reliant on sole income streams or particular individuals or foundations. And in your report, it did touch upon how many organisations are reliant on that. We're really fortunate at Macmillan. We do invest in fundraising and have done for a very long time, and we have that backing from our trustees to do that in order to grow all of our different income streams. So I mentioned I'm one of 6 fundraising directors at Macmillan. So just to give you some context, last year we raised 227 million. So it's a huge amount of income, and that's split across many income streams. So outside of my remit, we've got corporate, we've got trusts, we've got legacies, which is by far our biggest income stream. And I think last year totaled just over £90 million for us. We also are investing in innovation and new products, and they're continually testing. We know you have to probably try about 10 plus different propositions or products in order to get one to stick and really take off. And so we have a dedicated innovation team that are continually trying to test new products on a small scale to see what the next big thing. I think there's a big shift in what people want to do and how they want to fundraise as well. And you need to be really agile and flexible to that. I think the times have gone when you're launching something or trying something, you go out with perfection and you want everything right. Now it's just about getting something tested really quickly in a really agile way, and then building on it and building that growth if it should stick. And that's very different from when I started back in fundraising 15 years ago. So I think breadth of program and try and expand that as much as you can, and then you can dial down or switch up investment in areas that suit the current needs of the climate that you're operating in. That's probably where I think those that have more breadth will probably do slightly better when a crisis or anything happens in the marketplace.
Well, thanks, Hayley. And just lastly on this topic, Suheil, you mentioned how things feel a lot more positive at the moment. For you, are you seeing the direct impact as a smaller organisation of things like the cost of living crisis and obviously the conflict in Ukraine? Are those things starting to kind of come through into the fundraising landscape in India?
Yes, definitely. Inflation, cost of living is a big issue. Less so the direct impact of the Ukraine conflict, but obviously that's driving prices up, and then cost of living. So that is having an impact on us. Not again, like Katie said, we're not sure how it will impact fundraising or giving, but it's starting to come in sort of in the general discourse around sort of funding. So, but I think the impact we need to wait to see that. Yeah, I mean, in terms of the sort of other challenges, I mean, I feel like this is the decade of challenges and we just need to be prepared to be agile. Completely agree with Hayley that, diversifying and being sort of looking at different streams of income, and that is something that was in the report as well, is key, especially for the sport for development sector. Many actors are reliant on one or two big funders. So I think people are looking at that in the sector already. And they feel like, even though we are trying to come out of COVID, there is a sense that people feel other things are going to come up and are going to be disrupting. So I think people are planning for that. I mean, for what Hayley said about being, fundraising being sustainable, how do you, one question for small organizations like us is how do we build reserves? How do we plan for the future? It's really tough given the current circumstances because we're just trying to get through the present. Yeah. So I think as smaller organizations, I think we are ready to sort of be more agile in terms of preparing for challenges. For us, for example, over the last 10 years, we have had to do that, given lots of factors, even before COVID. So I think that is something that sort of everyone is thinking about already.
Yeah, absolutely. Great, thanks, Suheil. And I think that brings us into the next kind of topic, really, around something that's come up continually, and obviously through a lot of our work and through our report, diversification is something we're always supporting with and talking about. And I guess if I could come to you on this one, Katie, around particularly bearing in mind that lots of organizations who will be tuned in today will be small and have limited resources, and diversification can be an overwhelming concept, particularly when they're trying to potentially firefight and maintain current income sources. So I guess a kind of broad question, but like, what would your advice be in terms of like almost where to start when they're looking at putting together a fundraising plan with limited ability to invest, not necessarily having a big team in fundraising? How do you kind of know where to even approach this and where the best places are to invest your relatively limited resource into kind of the fundraising areas?
I mean, look, it's a big question, but I think, I would start by saying I think diversity is absolutely critical. I think we're in a really interesting time because I think whilst we're expecting that most people and businesses will see some level of pressure around inflation and cost of living crisis, we are also at a time where there's huge amounts of global wealth. And I think that's a really interesting challenge for us actually as a sector about really thinking about relevance. So I think what I would say is I think increasingly we're not in a world where we would say there's sort of one solution that works for every organization. I think it really is getting to the heart of what the makeup of your organization is and what sustainability means and looks like for you. So if you're an organization that has outreach into a large community who sees you as really relevant and important to what they do, then absolutely that sort of individual giving, encouraging individuals to support is really important. And I think the route to that is it's just conversation. It's about going to the spaces that people want you to be in, what works for you. And I think sometimes we make this really complicated. One of the things that we've increasingly started doing at the British Red Cross is just, going out and asking our supporters what they want from us and asking them what's working. And that sounds, it sounds so simple, and it's amazingly how few organizations do that. So I think if you've got that support base, then do that and have that conversation. I think though, trying to build a base of support in the current climate, if you're not one of those organizations that has say a large email file or a large group of people who might be engaging with your activities, it's difficult. And I think investment in what we would call individual giving, I think, is challenging. In the UK, it's a very, very saturated market. And I think it's a challenging place to start. I think that what we are seeing is, as I said, there are individuals, trusts, foundations who have money at the moment. And I think it's really about understanding what makes you relevant to their interests right now. And I think we've talked a little bit about COVID recovery, and sport for development is so critical in that space. And there's a really interesting story to tell. We're in a world where we're seeing increasing obesity. We're seeing, one of the things we're having a lot of funders talk to us about the British Red Cross is around community resilience and community cohesion, about things like ending loneliness. So there's loads of hooks in there. And I think sometimes it's looking really hard into your organization and saying, what are we doing that feels really relevant to funders, and starting to have those conversations. I think the other space, and I think we might go on and talk about this, Luke, so I won't say too much now, but I think the other space that's really interesting is how much we're seeing funders wanting to see partnership working. And I think that actually a coalition of small organisations can be a much more powerful funding proposition at the moment than one large organisation. So I don't think it's necessarily a disadvantage to be smaller and agile in the current climate. I mean, what all that takes is resource. And I think the one thing I would say is I think there's something about being really focused. And we've talked about diversification, but that doesn't mean trying to do everything. It means picking one or two things actually that you think are right for you and your organisation, rather than just sort of looking at a catalogue of what are all the fundraising options and investing in something in that space.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, couldn't agree more on that focus point. Hayley, come back to something you kind of touched on earlier as well, around not having kind of necessarily waiting to have perfect propositions when you're going out to the fundraising market at the moment, and being willing to test a number of different approaches, some of which might not work. How have you got any kind of mechanisms or advice in terms of when you know to pull the plug? How do you know if you're trying something and you know what, it's not really working for our organization, or particularly with a mind to the fact that some of these things are longer term, aren't they? You need to build and be patient at the same time. So how does an organization know when to kind of think, actually, that's not the right course for us, and we should focus on other areas? Other than intuition, is there any kind of way we can test that?
Yeah, I mean, we always want everything to work, right? And when we're coming up with an idea, you just can't understand why it wouldn't be as successful as you felt. I think the objectives of whatever this new thing that you're doing, whether that's an event, a proposition, campaign, whatever, what that reason is. If it's all about in-year income, I think that's really easy to see if something's working or not, because registrations, engagement, income in the bank will tell you that pretty quickly if you monitor all of your results as you go along. And the great thing is we're in a world of social media now, so you get to see really quickly what people's responses are to stuff that you put out there, which is hugely useful. It allows you to turn things off much quicker, or even sometimes just take feedback really quickly so you can adapt. So it could be your registration mechanism is not quite working for them, or something isn't quite right, so you can adapt pretty quickly. It's much harder for the long term, and that's a real big challenge. And you often have to have confidence in your approach. And with things like that, I think we definitely spend a lot more time working through that. So whilst I say nothing needs to be perfect, if it is about a longer term investment piece, then, and you might not see the rewards for a good few years, then you really need to think about what your shorter term KPIs are and how you can monitor that. But it's a really difficult one, and it will take looking at the data. Sometimes it just takes confidence, I think, from Macmillan's perspective, and I think from a lot of charities' perspectives, we're not very good at taking risks, because it's our supporters' money that we're using to take these risks and invest in the future, and we're really accountable for that. So we have to think about what our donor base would think to that, and what the long-term goal is. So it's really difficult, and I'm not sure I've answered that very helpfully for many people out there, because there's so many contributing factors around innovation, but you have to take the risk. And I think, building on what Katie said earlier, when you're looking at where you invest your time and everything, you've got to balance in-year income to stay afloat versus the long term, and innovation is a big part of that.
Yeah, for sure. And are there any kind of KPIs, metrics, other than kind of money in the bank, that you would be looking at when testing new approaches? That, and you mentioned things like engagement levels and kind of reaction from your stakeholders and audiences. Are there some key things you would look at when kind of making those assessments?
Yeah, we would look at also things around demographics. So, lots of work to move to increase the demographic of our database and things like that. So if we're looking for a new audience, we'll be looking at that sort of demographic that we would want. We'll be looking at reach of campaigns and everything that we're doing as well. If it's something directly related to our services, there would be lots we look. So take off of our services, hits on our website, calls to our support line, all different things like that. So there really are a lot of KPIs you can have a look at. I know it will really depend on what's available to your organization and also your technology setup, but particularly when you're doing marketing campaigns, there's a huge amount of resource to look at just in terms of clicks, engagement and stuff like that. And that that is fundamentally a lot of the stuff that we look at to see if something's really biting out there.
Sure. Great, thanks, Hayley. And yeah, okay, let's move on to some of those specific fundraising areas now then. And Suheil, kind of linked to this conversation, as an organization with relatively limited resource and capacity in fundraising, where are you finding the kind of real traction at the moment, and where are you prioritizing your organization's focus in this area?
So I think as mentioned in the report, there's a small story done on PSD, and it mentions our social enterprise approach. So we sort of started that about 5 years back, so pre-COVID, where what happened was that through our Sport for Development programming on ground, we were doing a lot of learning, and then we started training trainers from other organizations on that approach. We started developing curricula. We started working on sort of advocacy campaigns, and we saw that there was a market there and not many sort of experts who could work in it in the sport for development space. So that's something we took on, and there are more details in the story, but it cross-subsidizes some of our work, and all of that is unrestricted income. So that innovation actually held us in good stead during COVID. For example, when we had to take our programs online, not many funders came forward to fund the development of that. So we had to do it in-house. So all the unrestricted income we had helped us do that and reach out to young people through online mediums. So I think it gives us flexibility because, like Hayley said, a lot of the restricted income, whether it's donations or institutional grants, are restricted. So, we need to factor in what the donor wants us to do with that. Whereas for unrestricted funds, and that's where we can take some more risks. We can, put our neck out there and see what works possibly. So that's something that we continue to focus on now. As opposed to Hayley and Macmillan, most of our funding for our on-ground programming is institutional donors. Yeah. So we do get some individual donations, but it's a very small percentage. So that's what we focus on. That's what we focus on partnering with institutions who can support our programs on ground, and that's where the focus has been. We have not been very successful in working with corporates. There's been some success, others have been. And that's because in India, it depends a lot on sort of geographies where you're working. If you're in the sort of 6 big cities in India, a lot more support there, or close to the sites of their sort of factories or production units. So we've had not a lot of success. So for us, and I think in the sector generally, sort of institutional funding is something that is big. But what we've done over the last year and a half is that we have ensured that we don't, again, get too deep into one stream, and that we maintain all the streams. So even if we're not going to get a big amount from individual donations, we know that year on year there are people out there. We have a base. Our base is much smaller than Hayley and Katie's base, but they are willing to support organizations. So we will reach out year on year to them and hopefully then grow that. So even though the percentages might be different, there is diversity in our income streams. And as we move forward, as we grow, we might invest in some of those streams. But for us currently, the institutional funding for our on-ground programming, supported by our services component within the sport development sector, is what we are focusing on.
Sure. Yeah, as you say, that's been a huge kind of lifeline, particularly for the pandemic, for the sport development sector, hasn't it? Institutional fundraising. Katie, Suheil mentioned there corporate fundraising, corporate partners not necessarily being a big avenue for them at the moment. How are you finding that at Red Cross and here in the UK? Is that picture changing, or is the kind of economic uncertainty keeping that a little bit unpredictable still in terms of how the private sector is engaging with us?
Thanks, Luke. So I think it's a changing picture, and I think what we're seeing, and I'm sure, and I know we've talked about this in the past, is I think increasingly we're seeing this rise in corporate purpose, where companies are increasingly thinking about what is their route to being seen to have social purpose to their consumer base, and what's their route to having relevance. And in the past, a lot of that would be through partnerships with charities. I think increasingly we're seeing companies go directly to their consumers. So what's been really fascinating over the last few weeks is that we're starting to see big UK-based companies offering what is broadly charitable support to their consumers. So we know that Aviva, who are a big insurance provider, have actually talked about broadly actually giving money to help their clients who are worst off in the current situation. We're starting to see, increasingly, supermarkets making donations straight to food banks. We're seeing, of food rather than money. We're increasingly seeing, banks setting up financial advice helplines for their customers. So I think there's a really interesting space there about what is the role of charity and what can we offer. And I think that's a challenge actually to us all to keep thinking about that. What I would say is it sort of goes back to the point I was making, that there are sectors and companies who are still doing well in the current environment and who still want to give. And I think that rise in social purpose is increasing actually that agenda around what would have been historically a very traditional kind of CSR agenda is changing, but it's not going away in the sense that there is money there. And I think there are companies who want to engage. I think that where it becomes really important is we're seeing much more scrutiny around impact, perhaps, than we would have seen in the past. People are not just handing over money and saying, have a lovely time, go and spend it as you want. Yeah. They're saying, what are you going to do with it, and tell us. We're also seeing increasingly that those companies want to be more engaged in actually how the money's spent and how that works. So those more strategic partnerships where you might see a mixed model where we work with a big UK supermarket who've been incredibly generous in supporting us financially, have provided routes to actually us giving money through a hardship fund during COVID, but actually are opening up their resources and space within those supermarkets to do fundraising and community resilience activities, so helping us with our kind of charitable purpose as well. And I think the more that you can offer that sense that there's a real engagement and there's a real relationship that you're building that has kind of mutual purpose, the more successful those partnerships are. So I think the money's there. I think it's perhaps sometimes we have to work a bit harder for it than we have in the past. And I think that goes back to what I was saying about being maybe a bit more focused about where are those 2 or 3 relationships you want to build. It's not about just writing a nice letter to as many people as you can kind of get the address for at this stage.
And do you think it's important to think about that kind of co-creation model and not go to the partner with a off-the-shelf kind of proposal necessarily now, and because actually here's something we can come up with together that provides that mutual impact and benefit?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's something about being, true to yourselves as an organisation, and everyone has to decide how donor-led you're willing to be. So I think it's about being clear about what you might want the objectives of that partnership to be. But I think, as an organisation, what you're setting out to achieve. The routes to achieve that could be multiple. and actually working with a partner who might help you get there in a different way. I think we need to be more open to that sometimes. There's also a piece about, I think, particularly in the current climate, about what's that non-financial ask. So do they have reach? Can they bring a new audience to you? Can they do gift in kind? You know, what does that look like that might not be about a direct financial ask, which might build to financial support over time?
Fantastic. It's 40 minutes in and I haven't asked a single audience question yet, so apologies, that is really truly rubbish. So I'll correct that now. And Hayley, it's a question for you, linked to something you mentioned earlier, actually, about things like Facebook fundraising and kind of social media. So if social media fundraising, such as challenges, is facing a reduction, would you advise investing your energy and effort into this, particularly as a small charity?
No. To be fair, I probably should expand on what I said earlier. What we are finding, them new platforms coming onto the market like Facebook are growing, but the growth isn't quite as big as we anticipated it to be. There was a huge boom in lockdown. It's still a relatively new platform for us to use, so still finding our way. It's suddenly become highly competitive because, you know, with everything, every charity wants to be part of it as well. So it is growing. I was probably positioned it slightly wrong in the beginning. It's just not growing as fast as we thought it would be for us. But I mean, considering these challenges of people in their own homes doing it, you're not going out to an event. It's a really different proposition. That we did worry that once lockdown finished and we sort of got back into a normal life, that they wouldn't continue as well, because people could go out and enter a race. So they are still growing. There are, what I would say from a fundraising perspective, from, you know, when I first started out, there are so many ways to really get out to market than there used to be. You don't need to put on a physical event and invest lots of money in infrastructure. You can look to be creative and do something through social media platforms, because there is a huge community there. And that's what I've found really surprising and it's been really fantastic, is you do something on Facebook and it's like having a mass participation event, because the community in them all support each other and everything like that. So it makes it really easy for a charity or an organization to do. So I would say, yes, explore it. There's other platforms other than just Facebook out there that offer a really quick startup for you. So it's just being cautious. It's just investing as you go, I think, because you can stop and start them things really easily, and it's not a big investment. So but just be mindful that perhaps it's not quite as big as maybe we expected it to grow as fast.
Sure, great. And on this kind of theme, obviously there's a lot of talk at the moment around the kind of new and emerging approaches, particularly around things like crypto and NFTs and blockchain technology, which I think is obviously a very confusing landscape for lots of people. Katie, is that something you've explored at Red Cross? Is this something that you've kind of got a view on in terms of where that is at the moment? And do you see potential for that to be a real kind of component of a fundraising mix in the long term for the sector?
I would say it's something we've probably got a watching brief on, rather than it's something that we're actively embracing. I think anything that promises you that you'll get rich quick quite often isn't true.
Yep.
And I think that we've seen how volatile that kind of crypto and NFT world is. I think it's like any financial investment you make. If you don't fully understand what you're investing in, you probably shouldn't make the investment. I think that there are organizations where it's really relevant to who they are and their purpose. But I think it's an area where I would advise some real caution. I also think that this is the point where, you know, having a board of trustees where you have potentially some expertise or other kind of external expert advisors is really critical, because it's, you know, we are seeing people come to us and want to give in crypto. It's still, I would say it's still small numbers. Yep. At the moment, it doesn't feel like it's kind of a game changer for us. And I think we would be, you know, as I said, I think we're being incredibly cautious in that space. I think that, you know, if you expand that and you think about digital, I mean, digital is absolutely focus for us for growth. But it's growth probably in those spaces that Hayley was talking about understanding where communities are and how you connect with communities who might want to connect with you. And I think if you were going to put your energy and resource into any space, I would say, thinking about that and thinking about how you reach communities. We've seen some real success over the last couple of years in looking at new channels. So we've grown, for example, a really large TikTok audience, who are not necessarily a giving audience, but it's a route to engaging a whole new demographic and audience with our work. And my sense is that's the space I would invest my time and energy at the moment, probably, rather than, unless you really genuinely feel that you've got expertise that can guide you through that, and it's something where it feels it's a particularly relevant space for you to be engaging in, I think it's an area to be quite cautious.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, no, to definitely echo that. And Suheil, just not necessarily in terms of obviously the crypto kind of element to that, but the digital engagement, and I think this is something that's come through from one of the audience questions as well. How has that manifested for you? You mentioned obviously going and converting during the pandemic to do lots of engagement online. Has that been a kind of real growth area for you as a smaller charity about kind of reaching your audiences in different ways?
Yeah, I mean, given that we started about 10 years back, given we're small, we've mostly looked at sort of online engagement, actually. Also, given the sort of fundraising market in India is a bit different. You will very rarely have physical events like dinner events for charities. So it's a bit different. A lot of our engagement has been online. Like Katie said, keeping our audiences engaged on social media platforms, not necessarily from that they will sort of start giving, but they will be interested in our work, and maybe it'll help us connect with someone who is. So I think that's sort of been our sort of go-to to engage with our partners. I mean, many times I'll meet someone from the sector after a gap, and they'll tell me, "Oh, you've been doing all of this," and I'm like, "How do I know?" Through your social media. So it's a good platform. It's free, and it's easy enough for us to use. So given that we are small, when we started, and given the fundraising space is different in India, I think it's definitely a good platform. And I think you can do a lot more. Like, we haven't even explored, I would say, half of what we could do. Unfortunately, TikTok is banned in India now, so we can't probably engage young people there. But there are different demographics you can reach to through different social media platforms. So
great, thanks, Suheil. And yeah, I just want to. I'm really conscious of the time. There's so many more questions to get through. Katie, something you touched on earlier, which I think absolutely is going to be really relevant to a lot of the audience, around the networks, and actually, how can we better utilize that collaboration? And what would your advice be in terms of kind of coming together with other like-minded organizations to have that kind of stronger together approach when thinking about fundraising?
So I think there's probably two routes. I think one is looking at what are the funding opportunities out there, and not being afraid to think, well, that feels a bit big and scary for an organization of our size, and thinking about, actually, it's relevant to us, but we would need a set of people around us who might provide different parts of that offer. So to bring that to life, I know we're not a small organization, but British Red Cross has increasingly been looking at bringing together partnerships, because what we're seeing from funders is a real appetite to fund smaller, more grassroots, more organizations that are more connected into the community. So as an organization, we do a lot around refugee support, and we're increasingly seeing funding opportunities with people like the National Lottery or other sort of institutions, foundations, who are saying, great, you're involved, but you're too big on your own. We want to understand that you're really deeply engaged in the community, and there's a route to doing that. And whilst, we offer a lot of very community-based services, we've been thinking about who do we partner with to do that. So I think, take us as a big organization out of the equation. There is absolutely no reason why organizations couldn't be thinking about who else is operating in our space, and rather than seeing that as competition, what's the opportunity to collaborate? Because everyone will be offering a slightly different piece of the pie, and can we do that? Can we do that together? I think the other side of that, if it's not funding driven, is actually just understanding who else is operating, and it might be in your geography, it might be in your particular kind of sporting area, it might be in, you know, in a demographic or an audience or a particular kind of service offer you have. You know, are there other people doing similar things, and is there a route to connecting and being more powerful? I think we've always had this idea in the sector that perhaps we're in competition with each other, and I think increasingly that's not true, and that's certainly not the way that funders see the world. They want to see us working in collaboration, and I think a collaborative voice is really powerful. What I would say though is, I mean, of course, you can't underestimate the effort and resource it takes, because it's obviously much harder to do something with 3 or 4 partners than it is on your own. So I think it's doing that in a kind of cautious and well thought through way. But I think there's real opportunity, and we're definitely seeing a funder voice saying that that's something they're looking for at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Fantastic. And Hayley, in terms of thinking about, again, every possible avenue that we can utilize to support fundraising, clearly, particularly for lots of smaller organizations, every single person, individual within the organization can be a fundraising asset. How have you got any advice or kind of experience from your work in terms of how to really engender that fundraising culture, I guess, across the whole organization, where it's not just sitting with the person whose job it is to be thinking about the fundraising strategy? How can we embed that across the whole team, from trustees through to volunteers, to really ensure that everybody thinks about how they can support fundraising?
Yeah, and I think it's really important to do when you're a charity. I feel it's much easier to do when you're a smaller charity, and I used to work in a smaller charity, and it was much easier to build that sort of culture around the charity. So you do have to work really hard when you're a bigger organisation, but all your staff are big ambassadors of who you are, and it's making sure that everybody remembers and really understands what their purpose is there for, and what their impact is to the overall aim of the charity. So for us, it's the impact we have people affected by cancer. So we absolutely make sure it's really seen, the impact that we have. So that might be people from our services coming to speak to us. We have big campaigns around some of our bigger products, like Coffee Morning every year, London Marathon every year, where we try and get as much of the organisation behind it as possible. Even, just coming to a cheer point or holding a coffee morning in the workplace really makes a big difference. But we try and do this through all of our networks. So we have a really big network of volunteers that support our services and our fundraising. And again, they're in the community and are very well connected. And we want them to be ambassadors for us, so engaging them in the right way. And often that is just making sure everyone feels really close to the cause, feels really, really valued, and has some really great stewardship in place for them. But it is really important as a charity to have everybody aligned to what your purpose is and what your strategy is. And you need to be really clear in that in terms of your organisation to get everybody behind that.
Fantastic. Again, sorry, there's kind of one final question I can ask before I ask the panelists to kind of provide their kind of closing thoughts, and I'll make it an audience one because I've really let the audience down today with that. And Katie, it's for you, it's based on something you said earlier about there still being kind of a lot of wealth actually out there at the moment. So in the current time of financial instability, how would one go about engaging, particularly with a view for major donors and kind of high net worth individuals? What's the kind of best approach that someone can take to thinking about that?
It's a really good question, and I think it's one that a lot of organisations are trying to nail. So we see philanthropy as a real growth area for us as an organisation at the moment, and particularly shifting into those kind of more transformational strategic partnerships. I think that the best place always to start is going to be with your network, and I absolutely accept that not all organizations feel well networked, but actually it's really fascinating. And I used to work in community fundraising, and we did this quite a lot with our fundraisers, is actually physically map your network. So we would sit down and say, who do we know, who are we engaged with, who are our most loyal volunteers, who are our trustees, who are people who are coming to our events, and we would look at those and go, okay, well, where are they working? Who are they potentially connected to? What's the route to engaging with people? And I think in this space, we're not necessarily talking about people who are giving multiple millions of pounds. It could be someone who has the ability to give £1 or £5 or £10,000, you know, and I think it's about starting in those spaces and understanding who are you talking to. And I think realizing that what you're asking for is an investment in your organization. So you have to have a really compelling proposition. If those people were going to come and make that investment, what is it that they would get back in return? What is the impact that that would enable you to have? And I think sometimes in smaller organizations, the impact of a smaller amount of money can be much more powerful, because it might, I mean, it could be in terms of sustainability, it could be the difference between programs running or not. It could be about reach and about the amount of children or young people or vulnerable adults or whoever else that you're able to get to that is particularly important for that person. So I think there is, you know, having that really compelling proposition is important, but I do think investing time in really thinking about who your network are and not being afraid to ask.
Yeah.
So I think not being afraid to ask people to make introductions, and actually not being afraid to ask people and say, we're doing this new thing, would you consider investing? I mean, the worst thing that people can say is no. And I think it's a really difficult thing to do, and it's a really difficult mindset to get yourself into. But actually, I think it's amazing how much people do really engage. And if they can't do something for you now, it may be that they can in the future, or they can introduce you to someone else. And I think so just being really clear about that the need is there, the ability for you to generate impact is there, and you are looking for that investment to enable you to do it.
Fantastic. Yeah, thanks so much, Katie. And I can't believe the time has gone away from us, and I've got pages of questions left and loads of audience questions left unasked. So apologies to everyone who put them in and I didn't get to the panel, but just want to give each of you kind of just kind of a chance to give kind of a closing message or kind of key takeaways that you'd want the audience to kind of leave today with, so that we get the chance to kind of summarize all of your kind of all fantastic insights into a nice little soundbite. That'd be great. So Suheil, I'll start with you.
I think from the perspective of a smaller organization working in the sport for development sector, I think like knowing what your organizational needs are, I think for small organizations, it can be really tough to have like a proper strategy for fundraising or for many other things in place. But just thinking about that with your team, and like Hayley mentioned, it's a team effort. So getting everyone on board and bought into your vision, I think it's key. And I think for smaller organizations, it might be, again, it's a generalization, but maybe try and take that risk, try and be a bit more innovative. It might pay off or it might not. You just need to know the right time when to maybe disengage, or maybe then push forward to take it further. So I think our sector is an innovative one. So I think there are a lot of organizations and individuals out there who can think out of the box. So I think applying that to fundraising might be valuable.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Suheil. Katie.
So I think I would say, I think there's real value in focus. Don't try and do everything. Do the things that feel right for your organization and your strategy and the resource and skill set you've got. And don't be afraid to ask, talk to your supporters, your volunteers, the people who are engaging in your programs, and find out what they want. And that can be a really rich space for innovation, both in terms of them generating ideas, but also in terms of that sort of starting point on what you might do and explore. So I think just don't be afraid to have that conversation.
Absolutely. Great. Thanks. And Hayley.
Agree with all of that. Just, I suppose, the final party message for me is, despite all the challenges that we continue to face, people still want to do good. People still want to give to charity, whether that be their time or their money. It's just finding the right hook and focusing on the area that will have the biggest impact for your organization. I think loyalty is going to be really key over the next few years. It's going to be harder to acquire new supporters or going forward, particularly mass participation given. So I think loyalty and stewardship programs are going to be really key to keep those people on board and engaged, and demonstrating the impact, the local impact, particularly if you're a UK charity, will be really important going forward.
Absolutely. Brilliant. What a fantastic way to end. Thank you all so much. And obviously I've been trying to kind of distill this into some of my observations and takeaways as well, and some key things that just keep coming up. Absolutely, right from the start, investing in innovation could be key for sustainability, and we need to be willing to take a risk and take a chance. Diversification, crucial, but let's stay focused as well and not try to be all things to all people in terms of how we approach that. Speak to our potential donors, speak to our beneficiaries. Don't be afraid to kind of find out what they need and what they want. And I think, I mean, absolutely what has come through loud and clear is also, let's not be scared to ask, and be bold and be clear in terms of our compelling proposition and what impact we can deliver. But we've got to be able to make the ask as well. I mean, sorry, that's a poor attempt. There's so many other things that have been said, but I'm just trying to wrap up and conscious of the time. So please allow me to say a huge thank you to our panelists. It's been such a great session. Really, really appreciate you coming and sharing your insights today. Of course, again, thanks to all of our series partners for supporting the webinars and the report and all of the work that goes into that. I did say at the start that we're today launching a survey to inform next year's report. So I think that should be coming into the chat box soon, but also in all of the follow-up kind of communication, we'll be sharing the links to that. Please, 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 if you can find the time, it shouldn't take more than 15 minutes to complete, and please share with your networks. The more people we can reach with that, the stronger the research and the insight will be to help inform next year's report and all of the subsequent conversations. So yeah, please look out for that, and please share with your networks. Recording of the session today will be coming out as well next week, so look out for that, and please share with anyone else in the network who you think would benefit from it. And thank you all to you guys in the audience for such great engagement. I've seen the chat box flying, and there's been loads of questions we haven't been able to get to. So yeah, thanks as always for joining us. Yeah, thanks again to panelists, and see you all soon. Goodbye.